Today on Locked On Canadiens, there is a fun idea from a listener to talk about some Habs great and lots of goalie talk.
You are Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 961. Today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. My name is Laura Saba, also known as the Active Stick, and I'm not joined, as always, by the wonderful Scott Matla of Habs Eyes on the Prize. As you know, we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you get your team every single day. Unfortunately, every single day, one of us has been under the weather, so I am very grateful to Scott for covering on the Monday episode, and he did a fantastic job, 3 up, 3 down. I unfortunately was under the weather on Sunday morning, which is when we normally record the Monday episode. I'm not that much better, so you're seeing me in my sickest glory at the moment, but I did feel well enough to do the show, and unfortunately, as I said, Scott is not feeling super well, so you'll have to bear with me for today's episode. And today I wanted to have a little bit of fun. We had a lot of mailbag questions from our listeners last week that were a little bit on the longer side, and I thought we could come up, well, I'm going to borrow this listener's idea and extrapolate it a little bit. It was originally a mailbag question, but it gave me a chance to think about something we could do towards the end of the year. And honestly, I have to steal this idea. It's from our listener Charles W. And it was sent to us on Twitter, formerly known as X, for when it's a quiet time news-wise. It's not a quiet time news-wise, honestly, but what it is the news isn't fun right now, right? It's not super fun to be a Habs fan. So I wanted to bring a little bit of fun. So thank you so much to Charles for this amazing mailbag question. And I'll read it first, and then I'll talk about some parameters, because I want this to be a very listener-focused thing. I talked to Scott about it before I started recording, and I really want this to be very focused on you guys. A question. Make a decade's starting lineup of one Habs star from 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2020. I thought this question was really good because it automatically eliminates a lot of the past greats that are not going to be eligible because they stopped playing before 1970. It's unfortunate, but also I thought it was good because it like brought up a bit more of a challenge. And also it included 2020, which has been 3 years. And who do you include from that? So the parameters that I want to set is obviously 3 forwards, center, 2 wingers, 2 defensemen, and a goaltender. And it's a starting lineup, right? So like you can, like, I don't know if we want to do like sort of a second team all-star afterwards. But what I wanted to do initially was for all of you listeners to kind of give us the names of the greats from those decades. And then I was going to put it to a vote. So we were going to do polling on the YouTube, on Twitter. I'm not sure if Threads finally has their polling up. We're going to figure out a way to get as many votes in as possible. So then you guys will decide who the lineup is. And we're going to do this in stages. The first stage is going to be collecting the names. The next stage is going to be talking a little bit about some of those names that you've collected. And this will be leading up all the way up until I think the new year. We're very close. Like we're at the beginning of December. The holidays are coming up. It's time to be a little bit more lighthearted and have a little bit more fun. You know, we are going to keep recapping the games. We are going to still talk about the Canadiens and the Rocket. But if they're not giving us joy, On those days, we are also going to include segments about the stars that you have brought up, and we'll give a little bit of a brief overview. I also invite anybody who was around to watch those stars to send us memories of them, and we will read them on the show, because it's going to be really interesting. Like, I'm very interested to see who gets picked for the 90s and the early 2000s, who we narrow it down to, who we pick. I think for me, obviously, Saku's a no-brainer. I'm not going to entertain any other ideas, but you can make so many cases for other people as well, right? So again, what I want right now is I want the listeners to pick their favorite stars, and you don't have to pick like just one person because we are trying to build a lineup and we want to be as democratic as possible. The first step is we need the stars from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and I guess the last 3 years. I think Charles's question was specifically the year 1970, the year 1980, but I want to open it up a little bit and I want to have a little fun. Like I said, this to turn into a discussion, a debate. We love Habs history, but let's have, let's have a Locked On Canadians Hab history debate kind of thing. You know, everybody else does it, why can't we kind of thing. And so I would like to hear, you can send us an email, lockedoncanadians@gmail.com. You can put it in the comments on YouTube, and maybe do this for, let's say, all decade stars. Call that all decade stars. So like if you're leaving a comment in the YouTube and you want to distinguish between a mailbag comment or something else, all decade stars, ADS, anything like that. That would be welcome. So then we'll know like that's what you want to talk about, and feel free to wax poetic. We'll compile them all. We'll figure out a way to present them all and then give you guys a chance to vote. You can also, find us on social media. We're at LO_Canadians. That's also a possibility. Just make sure that you get your thoughts in about the all decade stars. So with respect to the specific question of 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000. Did I miss one? 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000. Oh, 2010 and 2020. That too. So with respect to that, like, I think I will leave that as an actual mailbag question, and Scott and I can tackle it this Friday. But in terms of the overall exercise, I think it's going to be really fun to talk about it. Like, I want to hear what your thoughts are on 90s stars. Like, who do we include from the 90s? Like, who do we leave off from the 90s? And it seems like sometimes like there's too many stars in one decade to choose from, and then in the other ones you're like, okay, who's really a bona fide? Like, there's got to be one person, there's got to be two people, and then you find that there is more than one person. It should seem like an obvious choice, and there's a lot of discussion and debate to be had, and it can get really passionate. So that is the exercise, the fun I guess game that I wanted to present to the listeners. I wanted this to be something that we can do over the holidays, something that is more than just talking about what the problems are with this team, because there are a lot of them. We're going to cover them. We need a break from that once in a while, and I hope you'll bear with me. And once again, thank you so much to Charles for this amazing content idea. Mailbag question itself will be tackled on Friday, and Scott and I can have, because this is the thing, I want a little bit of a head start. And I want to write everything down, and I want to bring it to Scott without him knowing what I said and without me knowing what he said. In the meantime, we do have another very, very passionate rant from a longtime listener about goaltending, and there was a little bit of a development as well with that Elliot Friedman alluded to. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in just one moment here on Locked On Canadians. But first, this episode is brought to you by Sleeper. A new NHL season. Well, we're pretty well into the NHL season right now. But first, this episode is brought to you by Sleeper. This NHL season, well into it, but it still brings so many possibilities. Anybody on this team, honestly, still could score 50 goals. It's unlikely, but they still could do it. And which team's going to hoist the Stanley Cup? You don't know. But you could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy hockey app. 3, 2, 1. But first, this episode is brought to you by Sleeper. This NHL season is still full of all kinds of possibilities. Cole Caulfield could find his game, score 50 goals. You don't know who's going to win the Stanley Cup. It could be the Ottawa Senators. It's unlikely, but it could be. And you could win big by playing fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick whether anybody like McDavid, Bedard is going to record more or less in their sleeper projections for anything like goals, assists, saves, plus minus, and more in a given game. Your entries can be made in under a minute. And there's so much stuff. You can also play daily fantasy NFL, NBA, MLB, college football on Sleeper. To win a 100 times bet on Sleeper, you need to correctly predict the outcome of 8 player stats. You heard me, Habs fans. You can win 100 times your money by playing daily fantasy hockey with Sleeper. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. All right, so I wanted to bring up, we had a very passionate mailbag. We had quite a bit of mailbag goalie questions, actually. There were a few. So I'm going to leave the very passionate mailbag question until the end. But the question comes from our good friend Richard. Hi, Laura and Scott. With Carey Price's and Yaroslav Halak's careers all but over, now might be the perfect time to revisit the old Price-Halak controversy as to which goalie the Habs should have kept. Are we now in a position to answer the question, which goalie was better / more consistent? 2. How would the Canadiens' history have been different had they traded Price and kept Halak? So thank you, Richard, for this question. I always love a good rehashing of the Price versus Halak saga, I guess, history. So when that trade happened, I remember very specifically a lot of Habs fans getting really upset and disillusioned with the Montreal Canadiens and thinking that they kept the wrong goalie. And it was right after Halak had stolen a pretty good playoff run, right? He'd stolen a few series. Obviously, it all came crashing back down to earth. This would have been the 2010 when they didn't reverse sweep. Did they reverse sweep? It was 3-1 against the Washington Capitals, I believe so. Yes, it was 3-1. It wasn't a reverse sweep. And the Canadiens managed to come back, and then they won against Pittsburgh, also widely favored to win the cup, and then they fizzled out and lost to the Philadelphia Flyers. The Flyers went on to lose to the Chicago Blackhawks, and that summer both goalies, well, not both goalies, the Canadiens had to make a decision as to which goalie they were sticking with in the long term, and they chose Carey Price. And for me, in hindsight, and at the time, like, I swear to you, one of my coworkers will back me up on this because we had this debate in the break room, and um, she said something like, "You're not a hockey fan if you would have chosen Price over Halak, or if you're happy about this." And I said, "I think that Bob Gainey is going to turn out to be completely correct." Sorry, I said Bob Gainey. Bob Gainey was the one who took a chance on drafting Carey Price, and it was widely criticized, or it was a shock at the time. But it was Pierre Gauthier that actually traded Halak to the St. Louis Blues. I'm so sorry. I mixed. It's not that I mixed it up. It's that I always knew that Bob Gainey was Carey Price was Bob Gainey's choice. Was he was his guy. Um, And I think he turned out to be right. I think Pierre Gauthier, like for all of the faults that he had, he turned out to be correct because Carey Price went on to become one of the best goaltenders of the NHL, like in the NHL, not just the NHL, globally, right? You cannot forget that he has won basically every trophy except for the Stanley Cup. He's got won every award. He's won every tournament, everything except for the Stanley Cup. And Carey Price stole so many games, so many wins, so many series, so many playoff runs for the Montreal Canadiens. Like he was the guy at the time. Like, do I think that having kept Halak would have been better for the Montreal Canadiens overall because his inconsistency would have come out, the fact that he simply was not as good as Gary Price over the course of his career. Um, that would have not masked a lot of the faults the Canadians had, and maybe the Habs would have done something about it sooner. They would have been a stronger lineup overall sooner. But the core that they had with Carey Price wasn't that bad, right? They had Max Pacioretty, they had PK Subban, they had Andrei Markov at the time. Brendan Gallagher was in his prime or early in his career. Like the core they had wasn't bad, but they didn't use the team. Like I remember getting so frustrated with the way they played, and then obviously again they started trading away these players that were really good, and then ended up really overall like what do they have to show for it over Carey Price's long career with the Canadians? Like did they get a Stanley Cup? No. And I think that's something that um people stick on with, like maybe it would have been different. Like I think I would have, like Carey Price gave us a lot to cheer for in very lean times. Carey Price has saved many a goal coach's job. Carey Price has masked a lot of faults over the course of his time with the Canadians. And is that better? Is that worse? Like, is there a guarantee that had the Canadians kept Halak, had Halak come back to earth, had all of their faults and all of their shortcomings been obvious, would the Canadians have made different choices in terms of their trading, in terms of tanking, in terms of their drafting and all of that? Like there's no guarantee. So to me, it like they could have just, continued to just be a mediocre or bad team without even trying, right? Like that it certainly felt that way in the Price's years. Like it didn't feel like, the Canadians don't have shortcomings. It felt like they were ignoring them because Carey Price was there, and they didn't seem to have a willingness to put a team in front of him that was capable of winning. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I hope you understand what I mean. Like, I think that overall, right now, if you ask me who is or was the better goaltender, I'm always going to choose Carey Price. I'm always going to say he was the more consistent one. I'm always going to say without his injuries, like the Canadians could have potentially gotten a Stanley Cup. I'm always going to choose Carey Price over Halak. And I love Halak. Like as a person, as a goalie, like he always seemed to have a great attitude. He always seemed to be at least on the Montreal Canadiens, right? Like it's tough to have like this anointed one show up, and you're young and you're trying to prove yourself, and you're, that and I think with Halak, like Montreal got something good, right? Like he deserves to be appreciated by Montreal for his time here. But at the end of the day, like no matter what, I'm still picking Carey Price any day in that trade. As to how the Canadiens' future would have unfolded, well, think about it this way. If Halak was not able to mask all of their flaws, and the Canadians went out and obtained a bunch of better players, whether it's by drafting or trading and trying harder to be better, um, and then they had those players, but they didn't have a Carey Price behind them, would they have won a Stanley Cup? Right? That's also something that you have to think about. And it's a great question, Richard, and I'm so glad that you asked it. And I think today we're just reliving history. But at the same time, it is time to talk more about today's world of goaltending, and that's all coming up in just one moment here on Locked On Canadians. But first, this episode is also brought to you by Collective. If you run a solo small business, you're an army of one, but you still need a CPA, a bookkeeper, separate payroll solutions, and more. Let Collective take care of the paperwork while you take care of your business. They say if you love what you do, you're never going to work a day in your life. But as a freelancer, there's always that dreaded paperwork that comes with it. With Collective, you can focus on your business of one while letting them focus on your paperwork. Collective is the number one financial solution for freelancers, contractors, and self employed entrepreneurs that lets you focus on your passion and not your paperwork. Let Collective handle all of the paperwork you dread, like corporate formation and compliance, taxes, bookkeeping, accounting, and even payroll. The best part, it's a fraction of the cost of a CPA. Collective knows that if your business of one makes over $80,000 a year, you will find the most value from their services. Join the thousands of solopreneurs who have saved an average of $10,000 per year on taxes with their structure. Join the thousands of solopreneurs who have saved an average of $10,000 per year on taxes with their structure. Right now, Collective is offering 1 month free and no onboarding fee when you go to collective.com/lockedonnhl and tell them Locked On NHL sent you. That is a $550 value for free when you go to collective.com/lockedonnhl and tell them Locked On NHL sent you. That's collective.com/lockedonnhl and tell them Locked On NHL sent you. All right, let's get back into our goalie themed episode. So we have received a very long rant from a longtime listener, Paul Branshaw. And so I'm going to go ahead and read it. What will it take to stop talking about sending one of Alan Montembeault or Primo to Edmonton? I understand that Edmonton is looking at Montreal's goaltending and salivating, but any deal that includes the Canadiens taking on Campbell's contract without Edmonton absorbing 100% of the cost should be a non-starter. Edmonton put themselves in his place, which they did, and no other team should help them press Control Z for their self-inflicted kick to the balls. Campbell arrived in Toronto with all of 58 games of NHL experience. He added 77 more regular season games and 7 playoff games in Toronto. Remind me again how that series ended? In short, when he arrived in Toronto, he had a small sample size, and I believe that Toronto's scoring ability helped to make his roughly league average statistics appear better than they were. I also agree with that 100%. Toronto, he was not a proven NHLer. He had a long enough career where he wasn't good or he wasn't reaching his potential for Toronto to then be like, okay, this guy's anointed. That, people like that always crash back down to earth. And I have no problem with Campbell himself, and that's the thing. And Paul Branshaw says that as well. He's like, he doesn't, he has no quabble with Campbell wanting to get paid, but he went from a team with so-so defense in Toronto to a big payday on a team with a defensive corpse. Edmonton, yes. The Toronto media and Leafs Nation made Campbell seem like he was a goaltending god among men, and I think he believed his own press. I don't know necessarily that he believed his own press, but I think Edmonton showed up and offered him a truckload of money, and I don't think that I would have been able to say no either, even knowing that I probably wasn't going to be able to get to that world-beating level that I had, for that short stint of whatever it was in Toronto. So obviously, Paul points out, he doesn't know how much Campbell knew that, about what he was getting into in Edmonton. But here's the thing, Edmonton was known to have a terrible defense that consistently cost them playoff wins when they have two of the biggest NHL stars, one of the biggest, best talents the NHL has seen in history in Connor McDavid, and they still kept losing. So this is the thing. So the problem that Paul has is, why should the Canadiens take him on? Any deal that includes Campbell should be ignored. Where would the Habs even put him? A $5 million ECHL goalie seems excessive. Edmonton's bargaining power drops with each new loss, so why even entertain the idea of throwing them a lifeline? When your neighbor steps in dog poop, do you help clean off their shoes? And this is the thing. And so here's he also sent a follow-up saying, the Canadiens shouldn't get him to buy him back. I don't wish ill on Campbell as goalie. I hope he gets his game back. But as a Habs fan, I want him as far away as possible from my team. There will be injuries on other teams, and while the haul might not be as lucrative, We wouldn't also be saddled with dead cap space, as was the result of another organization's going on a bender in July. Okay, so this was a very long email. There's a lot of meat to parse through it. But essentially, Paul is saying we need to stop talking about sending one of the Canadiens' good goalies to Edmonton in exchange for Jack Campbell. They shouldn't take on this contract because then they're going to have to figure out what to do with it. So earlier today, I was doing my customary scrolling and trying to catch up on hockey news, and there's a news clip from Elliot Friedman that I obviously stopped and watched, and it was talking about how at this point Jack Campbell is being allowed to get Manny Lagsay as a goalie coach to like bring him over to like the Edmonton AHL team or whatever it is, so that he can work with him. Apparently he had very good results with Jack Campbell. I don't know, like, here's my prediction is that Jack Campbell is never going to get his NHL level game back. Do you know why? Because he had little to no NHL experience with success before Toronto took him on. He had a hot streak. That's what he had. I feel bad. I'm sure he's a nice guy. I'm sure, like, obviously I can't play goal. Like, I know that. Like, I'm not, but he was never going to get back to that level, right? So like he can do everything possible to put himself in the best position, but he's still a giant albatross contract. And so whenever I was talking, I was like, Edmonton says no to these deals that like you guys kept pitching, like, well, Montreal will take on Jack Campbell and then Edmonton has to give a lot up. I do think they will. I do think this is enough of a problem for Edmonton to give stuff up. But they're not just going to give up Jack Campbell just to get rid of Jack Campbell. They want something in return. It does make sense. Like, there's too much discussion about a Habs goaltender because there's a surplus of goaltenders. Like, that's it. Like, that's why the Habs keep coming up. It's not like, insiders, I'm sure they're plugged in, but the reason the Habs keep coming up is because the Habs have too many goalies right now and they're not sure what to do with them. Nobody's sure what their future is. Nobody knows. That's the only reason, right? So I don't have a problem with these discussions. I also think that, like, Edmonton isn't like they're gonna let Jack Campbell go for the right, for the right return, and they're going to throw in sweeteners. I just think that people are overestimating the kind of sweeteners Edmonton will be willing to part with, not what they have, not what, any opposing GM should ask for. Like, I would ask for the moon and see what, and see what sticks. Just that Edmonton will be unwilling. Like, this is the thing. Like, I feel like Edmonton is going to be unwilling. And that's a very rambly rant. I mostly agree with Paul. I think Paul is a lot more passionate about this than I am. I think whatever's going to happen is going to happen, but I don't think that poor Jack Campbell is going to find his game back. I think he's going to, at the he'll be like a bottom feeding NHL goaltender. And again, that's just the level he was at. Like, he was so consistently at good AHL, not good NHL. And then, that hot streak kind of made everyone think that he was the future of goaltending. For me, it was probably never there. Like, it's just, there's too much of a sample size otherwise, telling us otherwise. Anyway, I have apparently a lot of strong feelings about Jack Campbell. In the meantime, this is it for me. I hope you're able to bear with me and my ramblings. I am, like I said, very grateful to Scott for covering for me yesterday. And I hope he'll be feeling well enough to be back tomorrow, because you guys seem to all like us better when we are hosting together. And we want to do that as much as possible. Thank you so much for bearing with me. Like I said, like as you all know, I'm having a lot of health issues right now. But I hope that this episode made sense to everybody. And in the meantime, make sure you're subscribed to this podcast. I promise you, we are often more coherent, and, more current, and we have a lot of things to say and we have a lot of stuff to cover. So make sure you are subscribed to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. You can find us all over social media. The podcast is at LO_Canadiens. I am at The Active Stick. Scott is at Scott Matla. Don't forget to tell your friends. And also make sure you check out Locked On Sports today. It is the first 24-hour streaming sports channel on YouTube. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you tomorrow.